and unmute when asked to do so. So, welcome, Keith. So delighted to have you here.
Aaron, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that is alive on the session today. Really feel fortunate to be here and share my experience. And the first thing I will say is it is exactly that. It is sharing an experience. I am the first to admit that I don't have all the answers, and so hope that each of you can take something from what I say today, and then whatever doesn't fit for you, discard the rest. But it was a very interesting conversation as I talked with Karen and some of the advisors on my side around what did I want to talk about today. And the question that was asked is, what do you get on your soapbox about? And the thing that I recognized that I get on my soapbox the most around is how much more I know and understand about being a CEO, but also about myself now than what I knew on day one of the opportunity. And at the end of the day, and again, as I was saying earlier before this went live, this may not pertain particularly to you, but it definitely pertained to me. And it's also pertained to a lot of people that I've seen throughout the search fund space, which is on day one, you don't actually deserve to be CEO. And so, what does that mean? If you go to the Webster's definition, to deserve means to be worthy, fit, or suitable for some reward or requital. And I think at the end of the day, um, when I look at what my experience was, I don't know that I was worthy, fit, or suitable. Um, and I think that, that doesn't mean you're not talented enough to be CEO. It doesn't mean you don't have the title. And it doesn't mean you won't deserve it. But I think the thing that is relevant and important from an operational perspective, at least for me in terms of being a search fund CEO and now a private equity CEO, is you earn the title and you earn the responsibility of being a CEO. And so what I hope to do today is just share a couple of nuggets that I've taken away um, in how you go about learning how to be a CEO and what being a CEO means and what it doesn't mean. So again, as I mentioned before, happy to talk through my experience and share it. But I also really want you guys to be active. And as I talk about my experience or anything that I've done, in my 7.5 years of running a business and almost, eight and a half or eight of being in the search fund community, happy to share that. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, you don't deserve it, you earn it. And I think that most people get this from an intellectual perspective. But oftentimes, I talk to searchers and there are some expectations. You guys are coming from some of the best schools in the world. You've had a lot of great experience. You've been bankers, you've been private equity professionals, consultants, other really amazing opportunities in the military. And I do think at times there can be, and I know for myself, it was this sense of, I know it, I got it. And from 7.5 years in the trenches, I would say that for most people, that's not right. You don't have it, but you definitely can't earn it. And so, again, as I mentioned before, my goal is just to simply share my experience and talk about some best practices that I saw that I think will help you, even though you may not deserve it on day one, deserve it sometime, hopefully before you leave the space. Next slide. So this is a big one, and I think obviously we're on Searchfunder.com, and overwhelmingly most of you are in the process of finding a company to buy. But I think being a search fund CEO is more than just about buying the company, and I think that it is all consuming when you're going through it. And I've been through that experience of understanding, do I make phone calls? Do I make emails? My LOI was just rejected. The broker wants me to have a proof of funds, or they're saying that I'm a searcher, so they're not going to show me the deals. I've seen 6 months of work go down the drain. I've seen all those things, but I think there can be, in my experience, and now on the other side, being on the board of a search fund company, funding search funds, now as an investor, I think there tends to be emphasis on what probably in your experience will be a very small part of the overall process. Um, just as background, and it seems like the olden days now, I raised my search in the spring of 2013, closed my fund in June of 2013, and started searching in July 2017, and ultimately found my company through emailing a list of brokers about 2 months in. So September the 11th, I'll never forget it. It was my birthday. I send an email a day before to a list of a couple thousand brokers looking for healthcare related businesses that had a compliance angle, and I got a hit back from a business just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And I'd never heard of medical physics in my life. And I reach over to my partner and say, "Hey, take a look at this." Show him the deal, and he's like, "Wow, it sounds interesting. Never heard of medical physics before." And we pursued that path, and 9 months later, we owned a business. And I think, you raise money for 2 years. You think that that is the most important part. You go through the ups and downs, but relatively speaking, I spent 9 months as a searcher, and I've spent almost 8 years as a CEO. And I think it is really important to understand that that is the primary job. And at most you're going to spend half of your experience as a searcher. That's if you hit a rocket ship and you basically sell 2 years after a 2 year search. But more than likely it'll be a third, 20%, maybe even 10% of your experience. And so think about those things when you're looking at these businesses. So often searchers will bring me a business. They will talk about the great margins or the recurring revenue, and the business is in a random place in Alaska, just for example, and they've never asked themselves the question of, do I want to run that business? It could be something that is not very attractive to them, or it's in an area that's not very attractive to them, or they think that because they're underwriting, the business has been growing 30% a year, that just by buying the business they're going to be able to hold on and ride that all the way to the end. And more often than not, I'm just not seeing that really be the searcher's experience. So again, even if you have the perfect deal process, you execute everything flawlessly, as an operator, you just need to recognize that buying the business is really a small part of it, and thinking through your philosophy on how you want to run the business, how you want to grow it. Do you really want to get into this because you want to be an operator long term? Do you have thoughts about becoming more of an investor and leveraging that experience to become an investor? Think that beginning with the end in mind and thinking through all those things is really important when you buy the company. If you just look at the stats, about 70% of searchers are going to find a business to buy. So most of you will find a business. So I just think it's really critical and really important that people think about, it's more than buying the business. It's really thinking about your philosophy on running it, why you want to run that business, where you want to live, and what you want the next decade of your life to look like. I think oftentimes, we think it's just 5 years and that's it. And in my case, I've thought I was going to roll off this job a couple of times now, but it hasn't happened yet. Do we have any questions, Karen, before we go to the next slide?
We do have a question from Cervantes, and it's just about if you're, the question is about, do you have to step in as a CEO? Uh, would you see a path where somebody could just step in as the finance piece and then have somebody else step up as the president of the company?
That is an interesting case. And what I would say is, there are always innovations on the model. But typically speaking, as from putting my investor hat on, I'm really making a bet on that person. And I'll go to a story, and I'll use some names, and it's just because these people are really impactful on how I think about things. But I was, in my first year or two of being a CEO, and my board was kicking my butt, and I just couldn't figure out what the right thing to say. The business wasn't growing quite as much as we wanted it to. It wasn't going down, but it just wasn't growing quite as much as we wanted it to. Maybe we probably weren't executing completely on the plan. And we happen to be talking to Andrew Saltoon, again, who was a CEO a couple of years ahead. He might be invested in a number of your funds now because he's an investor. And he said something that always resonates, and I steal it, and I still give him credit for it. But he says, as CEO, everything is your fault. And it's such a freeing concept of, when everything's on your shoulders, it's all your fault. But then it's very empowering because you have a way to change it. And so I give you that story just because I say, as the finance person, I'm not sure you're in a position where everything else is your fault. And I'm just, we question the accountability there. Because at the end of the day, my business partner and I shared 100% of the accountability. Whereas as the finance person, you may or may not have that buck stops with me. And as investors, we're backing you because we know that you have, the interest and ultimately the responsibility. And that's really important here. And we'll talk more about responsibilities. We talk about, why people may or may not deserve to be CEO. Got another one?
Yes, we do. They're
All
coming
righty.
fast and furious. What are the top 3 characteristics you look for when acquiring a business?
Top 3 characteristics. Short version is again, I bought a business that I thought stuck very closely to the search fund model. So it was a highly recurring revenue business with high margins, low CapEx requirements, and it had some industry tailwinds. So again, I think recurring revenue is probably number one. High margins is probably number two. And then I think obviously industry tailwinds would be number three. And I know people are deviating from the model more, but as again, another one of my really smart investors, Will Thorndike, talked about recurring revenue when he asked me that same question when I was trying to raise money from him. The big thing about recurring revenue is it gives you time to figure out the business. And this all ties into the idea of not deserving to be a CEO because you will not know exactly on day one how you're going to grow your business. But if you have recurring revenue, every year 80%, 90%, 75% of your revenue is going to come in no matter what. It gives you that space and time to mature into the role and figure out what are the growth levers in my business and how am I going to pull them in order to reach the exit that I'm looking for. So those are the things. They're in the Stanford study. They're in everybody's PPM, and then people ignore them. But they actually are the criteria that I look at in any of the businesses that I've purchased, investments that I make outside of the search fund space as well. Let's go to the next slide. So the second sort of thing that I learned is, being a CEO and being the leader of a business is more than a model and a spreadsheet. And all of you as, searchers, potential future CEOs, you're going out to raise funds for your business and you have to put a model together and it's going to say it's going to grow organically at X amount. You may or may not factor in some inorganic growth as well. You'll probably assume some margin increase or expansion. You won't know how that's going to happen. But I find in my experience, I stuck too closely to the spreadsheet and I didn't think about the business as a whole. And that's why I say leadership is more the model than the spreadsheet, because oftentimes the model will tell you you should cut costs. The model will tell you that your EBITDA, if you make a certain investment, is going to go down. And a lot of times in actuality, when you're actually operating the business, you may need to take your EBITDA down. You may need to recognize that that cut that you're going to make is actually a person who is going to be really valuable to your growth plan. You're going to make bets that you're not 100% sure how they pay out, or there's some risk in them paying out, but you have to make them in order to pull the right growth lever. And that is something that you don't know on day one. I did not know this. This is probably the one of the later lessons that I learned, and I think I probably really learned it now by being a private equity CEO, because there's a mindset in private equity in particular of you are oftentimes going to need to make investments or certain bets in the business, whether that's, being a serial acquirer. In our case, we've spent a lot of money in building a software system to run all the operations, all the back end operations of our business. So it may be technology, it may be hiring that right salesperson. But the model in the spreadsheet that you send in your sim is going to say every year your EBITDA goes up. But in practice, you may have to make decisions, and you may have to keep people, or you may have to cut people or replace them with an upgrade, which, I've had to do that as well. And the spreadsheet is going to tell you something different than what you know in your gut and what your senior leadership team or your managers or your board is telling you. And I think that that is something, again, on day one that I think people are really reluctant to do. Everybody wants to make the spreadsheet model that they send out work, but, new information requires a new decision. And oftentimes I think, we're so anchored to, I want to be able to say the EBITDA only went up, or I don't want to make certain investments, even though they're the right things for the business, or they're going to give me an additional bandwidth. And I think that just comes from maturity in the seat. And it's something that you don't have. I definitely did not have it on day one, but looking at the business holistically, and not just monitoring it strictly by the spreadsheet. Now you have budgets and you have all those things, but learning that leadership is more than a model and a spreadsheet, I think, is really profound. Something that most people don't have on day one, but that you need to develop over time to be really successful. I saw maybe a question, Karen.
Good eye. So, how long does it take in your experience to get settled into the business? And the person asked on it says, I do realize it's situation dependent,
Yep.
but just wondering how long you think it would take on average.
I'll tell you how long it took me. Um, and I think it's on the longer side. So I come from a, say, slightly non-traditional background. So I was a business undergrad major. I actually went to law school, and got a law degree and a master's in real estate development. Ultimately ended up practicing M&A law for a number of years, doing deals for private equity groups. I worked on Wall Street for a number of years in risk management and compliance, and then ultimately decided with my business partner, who was more of a traditional banking MBA of Chicago, to pursue a search fund. It took me 2 years. My first, and I tell people this all the time. Business history is often edited. You don't hear about the ugly middle or the ugly beginning. You may hear about one little challenge, but ultimately it's like they hit a home run. It's up and to the right. My first 2 years were crappy. Um, and there were many times where, I got feedback. I'll never forget my first 360 from my board, was not great. I had a lot of deficiencies. I think they still believed in me, obviously, but had a lot of deficiencies, a lot of blind spots. Um, and it took me 2 full years to, one, build the trust of the people in the organization, two, figure out what my role in the organization should be, and three is to focus. I think when I see entrepreneurs, I see CEOs now, they are letting their 100-day plan, their budget, life, customers, employees run them ragged, instead of saying, these are my three levers for growth, and I'm going to focus on them. And I'll never forget this. Jim Ellis, who was one half of the group that bought Assurion, or bought Road Rescue, which ultimately became Assurion, spoke at Stanford Search. And it was so impactful. He said, Kevin and I spent 150% of our time on growth, and we spent 50% of our time on everything else. So 100% of, one person's bandwidth and a 50% of another person's bandwidth was focused on growth, and everything else they were selectively, they were selectively crappy at it. And I think that's really a testament to focus and understanding what you need to focus on. So I think in an ideal world, it would be a year I don't think I've seen many people it takes less than a year. But for me, it took 2 years. I was slow, but I think that I needed to get my sea legs, and that's why for me, I'm always looking for people to get through their first 24 months. I think if people can get through their first 24 months with some semblance of, I think I understand how to grow the business. I think I understand how to communicate with my board effectively, to communicate my plans. And I think my employees somewhat buy into what I'm saying and what the plan is. I think they have a really good shot of a positive outcome. If they have a ton of problems in the first 24 months and they can't get over it, like that generally means it's probably not going to go that well, from my experience.
I'd like to ask a question about
Sure.
dealing with your board, because you're not only leading your employees, but you're leading the board. Do you or a leadership position with the board? Do you have like any tips for now that you're also an investor, for folks who are starting out as far as the communication piece of it?
I do. Um, I think you should communicate more than I did. So, we had our first board meeting was 2 months after we bought the business, just because of scheduling. We had not, I mean, before we bought the business, they did business, they did checks and wrote on green ledger paper. So there was no electronic, no QuickBooks or anything. So we basically got the financials the day before our first meeting and then sent them out. And that just kind of gives you a sense of what it was like for us for those first couple of board meetings. Um, but the board meetings, when they started to work, there were a couple of things that we did. One is, um, we did one-on-one debriefs before the board meeting. My general advice, and the advice that I heard from other really smart people, is you don't want to really make decisions at the board meeting. You want to make decisions before the board meeting. You want to sort of flesh those out, workshop them prior to the board meeting. Um, and I think those are really key. So when the board meetings were working well, we were doing one-on-ones with both of our board members before the meeting to say, hey, here's our agenda. Here are the key decisions that we want to make. Here are the key things that we want to talk about. Do you have any thoughts, suggestions? Is there any additional research that you'd like us to see? So that's one. When you're just starting out, it's really important for you to report back to the board. Here's what we thought we were buying, and here's what we actually bought. And I think that that's critically important, of almost re-underwriting the deal and making sure, hey, if I thought I was buying this type of business, then it's this type of business minus XYZ. Knowing what that XYZ is critically important. Also, telling the board what you've learned. It may not just be we bought a different business, but hey, I've learned some additional things about the business, because from the board's perspective, their general business knowledge is much, it exceeds yours. Again, you don't deserve to be CEO. Their knowledge, they've been there in the seat, most of them, so they actually know what they're talking about, but they don't know your business. So to the extent you can educate them better, is really key. And then I think the third thing is you have to learn to take what is really important from what they say, um, and leave the rest. And when I say leave the rest, I mean leave the, oh, my board is just being a hard ass because they don't like me, or because they don't agree with my decision. This is not to absolve boards from being responsive and thoughtful and prepared and being reasonable. But I think there's a lot of emotion that gets tied up into these board meetings and what the board meetings have to say. Whereas if you really listen to them and you need to focus on collections and physicist management, in my case, and sales, those are probably the things that you need to focus on. And so taking what you need and leaving particularly the emotional side of it there is a skill. And again, I did not have that on day one, but I think those are things that you can do to really be more successful. And then lastly, ask for feedback. So I had a business coach that I had do a 360. And while it was extremely difficult to get that feedback, it changed the dynamic of my board relationship. And now my two, I had three board members. One was on for 2 years, the others were on for 5. Have great relationships with all three of them, particularly the two that stay for the 5 years. And they will tell you again about that growth, as well. It was because, I did some of those things.
What a great story. We have a couple more questions on the chat that I do feel like are timely, and then we can move on
Okay,
from there.
perfect.
Marlon asked, did you ever get to the point where you thought of firing yourself and hiring a CEO, or were you all in no matter what, thinking I'm learning and will succeed?
Um, Again, I I never thought of replacing myself with a CEO and then sort of staying in another position because I think, that would have been confusing for me and for them. But did I question whether or not I was going to make it? Yes, I did. Um, Most people, unless literally they hit a rocket ship, if they were being honest, yes, they doubted themselves at some point during the process. I think being the CEO of a business, of a growing small to medium sized business, is one of the hardest things that someone can do because it requires so much growth of you as a person, so much empathy for the people around you, and then so much in terms of skills and knowledge of finance, marketing, sales, operations. It is a really difficult thing. And that's why most search fund investors are trying to find the smartest people from the best schools with the best backgrounds, um, because it makes it easier to sort of have a proxy for whether or not people are smart, people are coachable, and people are resilient. And the resiliency, more than anything, was my superpower. But it was hard. I'll never forget. About a year and a half in, I'm sitting on the stoop of my house, telling my wife about, you know, a board meeting that went awry. And I'll never forget it. And it's also, and I will say that sometimes, this is not a solo sport. So even if you're a solo searcher, very often getting through is not a solo sport. So you may have a parent, a brother and sister, a best friend. In my case, it was my wife. And she basically told me, look, the board may be right, or they may be, as my mom would say, wrong as two left shoes, but buck up. And you moved me up here to run a business. So you should damn well run it. And you should figure out how to make it successful and make it what you want to be. And I was taken aback because I think, I thought she was questioning my manhood a little bit, but ultimately at the end of the day, it was the right answer. And those angels, I call them angels, come at different points. And, my wife was definitely an angel. Um, there were several investors that weren't on my board that were angels where, literally when I didn't know, they would just call to pick us up. And, there were people, employees that I had, the president of KGHP, which is the original company we bought, now that we've expanded. She was an angel. She came to us 2 months in and told us that we needed to get rid of the original sellers or we were going to have a mutiny on our hands. And we did it, and we relied on her and others to stick with us, and they did. And it was amazing. But again, that's why, on day one, you're not ready for all those things. But angels will, I believe in angels. I'm a preacher's kid, and angels will find you if you're resilient. We got another one, Karen, or we want to
We
move
do
to the.
have another one, and that this relates to the board. How did you and your partner Mike know who was right for your board?
We, you know, our we we there are two sort of approaches. There are the approach of, I think I want a board that is going to give me maximum flexibility. And so there are board, members out there who, are very laissez-faire in their approach, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? People want to be entrepreneurs. They're coming from these great schools, and me hand holding and running the business is not what I really want to do as an investor, and not really what they want me to do, as a board member. I think there are other board members that I think are, I would say, more exacting. They push a little more, and Mike and I went that direction. And we also went with people that engaged with us the most, because we felt like we needed to learn and grow. And so the people that were on our board, were tremendous in that. I mean, I learned so much from them. They also made me really mad at times, and they know it. And I'll never forget, Rich Augustin is one of the members that was on my board for 5 years. And we sold the business, and I'm down in Palm Beach with a new private equity group. And it's our first time connecting face to face since I sold the business. And, we're having a drink, and he's telling, how proud he was. And he said, it was never my job to be your friend. I wanted you to respect, me, and I wanted you to respect the process of running this business and making sure I put you in the best position to be successful. And you may not like it, but you will respect it. And I did, because now, did they get everything right? No. Did I get everything right? No. But I think the results speak for themselves. We had a really great outcome. We have a really great relationship. I still call them when I'm in hairy or sticky situations in my current business, because they know me and they know the business. And so again, I think those relationships um, are just as important, if not more so, than being the CEO, the title, the money, all those things, at least from my perspective. So ultimately, you have to know what you need and then seek that out. And everybody knows themselves the best.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next slide.
Um, this one, again, I won't spend too much time here, but I think this is really important, and this is about being, I would say, positional versus directional. So a lot of times, people will talk about, I want to be a CEO so I can have a really nice exit and, have money, and then I will go and be an investor, or I will retire, or I will run for public office and those kind of things. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand, and I'm a capitalist, no one that does this, is, a bleeding heart here. Everybody here believes in business. They believe in, capitalism. They believe in, doing things that are necessary to build a business. But everybody here has a model, and it shows an outcome. And at least for Michael and I, we had it in our PPM, and then we never looked at it again until we sold the business. And I know people think, that's crazy, and you have to, and again, you should always be thinking about what your exit is going to look like. But from my perspective, it is much more about the journey of getting to the exit and what you become from a skills perspective, the type of relationships you build, um, than it is about the money. And it's funny because, I'll just give background. I was the first person in my family to go to college, first person in my family to go to grad school. Um, I didn't come from a lot. I lived in a lot of places growing up, kind of bouncing around. And so, having a lot of money was always the thing that you wish for, but you never really knew it was going to happen. And um, I always had this joke with a lot of friends of mine that when I made money, I was going to play 50 Cent, I Get Money, as loud as I possibly could in my car and just ride down the street with that music playing, because that was going to be sort of my triumphant way of showing, how much money I had, and everybody would laugh and have a really good time with that. But I'll tell you what I actually did when I closed my deal. I negotiated because I was doing most of the negotiate. I was doing almost all the negotiation with the other side. So I was on with now one of my partners from the private equity group. We were negotiating the last side letter. Um, we put that to bed. We set the closing call. We had the closing call. I got off the closing call. I text with my board members to tell them that we had the closing call. The deal was done. They sent some um, really great congratulatory messages. I was in my apartment in DC. I called my wife and told her that it was done. It was finished, and she started telling me like what a great job I did, and I cried. I don't really cry that often. People that know me, I'm not really overly emotional. And it wasn't like, it wasn't the ugly cry, but it was a very silent, like just tears started coming down my face. And the reason why is it's never what you think it's going to be. For me, it was a couple of things. It was knowing that I had changed my family's life. Um, in a very meaningful way from the work that I did. It was also just the responsibility of it. One of the things Karen mentioned, on the write up here is, I've, along with Mike and others, helped co-organize the Black Searcher Network. And one of the big things that Mike and I really focus on is bringing this opportunity to others and wanting more people of color to have the opportunity to potentially be entrepreneurs and buy a business. And it was the reflection of knowing there haven't been a lot of people, and frankly, at least anecdotally, we don't know of any others yet, but there's some coming, people that have successfully exited in the search fund space. And it was the gravity of knowing that I had done something like that and I could be a trailblazer for others. And the last thing was, it was a relief. There were, and someone asked the question, there were so many times where I wasn't sure whether I had bitten off more than I can chew, and whether or not the decisions that I was making, Michael was making over those 5 years were the right ones. And to know and to be validated by a really great outcome that most of the decisions that we have made were the right ones, and that the resiliency that we have shown had been paid off was overwhelming. And 2 years and some change after that, the other thing, about saying that being a CEO is not about the exit is it hasn't actually changed my life that much. I have a nicer car and I have a house, but I still get really excited about doing deals. I still love mentoring other people in the search community. I still laugh at the same jokes and eat the same food. But the skill acquisition and the journey that I've been on has been transformational. And now being able to share this with folks like yourself is what really makes um, the journey worthwhile. And so, again, not saying that the exit is important and not meaningful, but just in my experience, what you think you're going to do when it happens and what actually you feel and what actually goes through your mind is likely to be very different. Do you have any other questions, Karen?
No questions in the chat as of yet, and I've got the screen share back on, so I can move on to the next slide.
Perfect. And so to sum it all up, again, I think that being CEO is recognizing in a very specific way that it's not all about you. And in most of our lives leading up to raising capital to be searchers and search CEOs, we've generally ticked all the boxes, and it has been about us. It's been about our accomplishments. It's been about our accolades. It's been about our work product. It's been about, our ability to interview, our ability to tell our story. And once you become the CEO, on day one, you may not recognize this, and I definitely did not on day one. I thought it was about me, and that my force of character and my ability to sort of, I call it, put on the cape and be Superman, was what was going to make it happen. And in actuality, it has been all about the relationships that I built. And I coach this with all the searchers and the CEOs that I talk to is, and my own management team is, and I have to coach myself is, I want people that believe in being relational more than being transactional. And I think that that is critically important because keeping score and worrying about what the to-do list is important, and you have to keep people accountable and you have to hold them against metrics and scorecards and all of those things. But when I really think about me having the ability to sit here today and talk with each of you about my experiences and journey, I don't think about specific tactics that I decided or Michael decided that got me here, but I can definitely tell you names of people. My mom, first and foremost, who bought me Reginald Lewis's book, um, you know, all those years ago and convinced me that being a lawyer was something that was possible from a kid who in family had never been to college. My dad, who, worked multiple jobs to make sure that I had opportunities. Teachers that told my parents that I was smart enough and that I should be in accelerated classes. My ROTC instructors who, when I led my RTC unit in high school, really showed me how to be a leader. Again, professors in college, internships that I've had, jobs that I've had, and mentors that I've had at all my jobs. My investors in my search fund, my board members in particular, and just so many other people, other CEOs that mentored me. I think when I think about my experience, I don't remember tactics, I remember names. I don't remember great decisions on my end. I remember difficult moments where those people's words, those people's experiences changed the trajectory of my course. And what I get the most satisfaction out of today, being 7.5 years, is I don't really do much day to day that actually impacts the business other than making sure that my team is supported and having the right team members and the right strategy in place and encouraging them. And what you'll recognize once you become further and you go further down this path, you build a bigger business, is that being the CEO is mostly not about doing things, but mostly about picking the right people and picking the right direction, and then making sure that you're in those guardrail positions to make sure people don't go too far off the guardrails. But it doesn't require a cape or leaping tall buildings in a single bound, but it does take empathy. It does take active listening. It does take, you know, not being too proud to ask for advice, being coachable. Those are things that I look back at, and I really am grateful to all those people who helped me be where I am today. Um, and it helps me tell a really real story, which is, everything wasn't up and to the right. My first 2 years were crappy. I had challenges managing my board because I didn't know how to communicate well with them. And ultimately, by developing myself, by earning it with my employees, with my investors, with my board members, with my customers, um, that's how I know I am a real CEO today. It's not because I got a title when I signed the documents at closing, but it's because I've put the blood, sweat, and tears in. I've built relationships with people, and I know those relationships will carry me further. So those are just a couple of notes from my perspective. Hopefully they're helpful. But with the remaining time, I'll take any other questions from folks. Lastly, um, happy to connect with people again. Keith Burns at lawwater.com, lawwatercode.com. Lawwater is Michael and I's investment vehicle that we invest in search and other companies with. So I like to keep that where I get most of my search communication. If you have my Apex email address, I'll answer you there as well. But this is kind of my preferred way to get in contact with me. A lot of people reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will admit that I'm not the greatest at checking LinkedIn. So you're much better off emailing me directly. But if I do get to you, it's not because I'm just missing you, but I don't check it that often.
So Keith, you mentioned the Black Searcher Network. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? How often does it meet?
Yeah.
Kind of the
So
focus?
Yep. So I would say the focus is three things. So again, we figured out that we want to help people along three major points in their search experience. First is prospective searchers, so people that are making a decision to go into search. The second one is actually searchers, which is probably the most of where people are. We've just communicated about two events targeted towards searchers. One on developing a scorecard for finding a good deal, and then pitfalls and challenges in due diligence, which is one that I'll be leading in August. One's in July, one's in August. If you want more information about that, email me, and I'm happy to forward those dates along. And we'll have more information and save the dates coming out for that. And then the last point is that first 24 months of searching. Um, and again, that's what I've identified in others as the critical moment of we can intervene as much as we can or share best practice in that first 24 months. We have a chance to really impact folks. So we're putting together, events. I think we had 3 events in 2020, and those were more just fireside chats, really, talking about what it's like to search during COVID, dealing with some of the challenges, post George Floyd, and really just saying, hey, we want to bring a group together, who have common interest. I think in 2021, everybody that is on the organizing committee has a day job. They're running a business. So, it's taken us a little while to get, other events up and running. But we have, I would say, about 3 or 4 events this year. And then the other thing that we're going to be doing more of is getting more volunteers so that, people can say, hey, this is an event that, we want to see the Black Searcher Network support. And we'll be doing that. And we're also connecting with other similar groups in VC that have done, further along in their journey and sort of taking best practices from them as well. But I'm super excited about it. Wish I was a little less busy so I could spend more time on it. Um, but we're hoping it to be a resource. And the other thing is it's also just a resource. I've had tons of people reach out to me as they're looking at deals or thinking about getting a search or once they bought a business. And I've just workshop issues with them. Again, I've seen a fair amount, and I also am pretty engaged in the community. So if I haven't seen it, I generally know somebody who has.
That's awesome. Thank you, Keith. And there's kudos from Marlon, who also gives kudos to your wife. Being married, I know that I've had that conversation at least once with my husband, and it's so yeah, many. She's definitely a true winner. So I have a question about that 2-year period. What I hear a lot from searchers who have newly acquired is that they tend to kind of fall back on the things that they know. So if they were a finance person, they tend to focus on the finance and not the people. If their expertise was sales, they tend to focus on that. Do you feel like you were focusing more towards where you thought your strengths were rather than the rest of the business, or try to lean into
Yeah.
that?
In my case, I was focusing more on where the most acute problem was. So basically, my business was 10 people were generating $5 million in revenue. And so losing any one of those people was pretty impactful. So I spent most of my time learning the business and developing relationships with those physicists so that they didn't leave. Um, and what I think we didn't focus on enough is, as I mentioned before, Jim Ellis talking about him and Kevin spending 150% of their time on growth. We didn't spend nearly that much time on growth between Michael and I combined. And part of that was just ignorance of understanding the business. Part of it was we didn't really understand that, hey, you have a window, you need to pick your 3 growth levers. It could be organic revenue, it could be price increases, it could be leveraging technology, it could be cross-selling, it could be, a number of different things. But figuring out what those 2 to 3 growth levers are and sort of pushing on those, I don't think we identified well enough what they were. We just said, hey, we think we're going to grow 10 to 12%. And that's the one thing about the spreadsheet models and just saying, all right, it's grown 10% a year. So I'm going to say, oh, it's going to grow 8 to 10 without sort of further dissecting what are the growth levers that are going to drive that. So um, for me, it was less of, because I was a lawyer, right? We had some legal issues too, but I wasn't trying to be our lawyer, but it more so for me, I was dealing with what was most acute, but I wasn't really focused on growing the business. And in my experience, growth can cover over a lot of issues. So, just making sure that you have some focus on growth and you're thinking with your board around what the growth levers of your business are. I think is time well spent. Even if you don't execute on it in the first year, at least having those conversations and understanding what that is a really good use of time.
And we have a question in the chat from Cervantes. Could you share how you decided on your partner, Mike?
He was just hanging around. No, Michael and I had known each other for over 20 years. So, well, we've known each other now for over 20 years, but Michael and I were both undergraduates at Emory. We were in the same fraternity, really close friends. And he was someone who also had a real strong passion for entrepreneurship. And he also covered those spots that I wasn't good at. So again, I mentioned I was a lawyer. I wasn't an MBA, so he had that covered. He was much closer to ETA in that community than I was at the time because I was working on Wall Street. Um, Given his finance background as an investment banker, he was able to understand the models and the accounting and some of those things where it was a little bit fuzzier for me. But I was great at, negotiating deals and a lot of the operational things and attention to detail. And, like to take charge and manage people, right? So I had more of that experience. And so um, you're really looking for a compliment, I think. My what I say is the best, all else equal, if you can have a good partner, that's like your top option. If you look at most of the most successful search funds, most of those are partner searches. Um, and I think there is some data out there that says partner searches do, as a whole, do better than the single searchers. So I think a good partner is number one. Then going solo is number two, and then a bad partner is number three by far. So the problem with partners is sometimes it can be binary, and it's either a really good situation or a really not good situation. I knew Michael and I had enough experience with each other and enough at stake that we wouldn't let this keep us from not being friends, right? For no other reason than we share too many friends in common. um, and he was in my wedding, so like, breaking up as friends would have been really hard to do. So it worked out, but I think it was the compliment, and he really helps me see myself. So he's much more of an empathetic person. He's the master networker and relationship builder. So like when I'm firing off the hot fire email, like I send it to him first, and he like cuts it down and kind of tempers my personality, and then I send it out. And then, vice versa, I'm able to do the opposite for him. So it's been a great run. And I think also challenges there. We shared a business coach, and we've had sessions where, we had to calibrate and get on the same page. But again, I think that investment has proved to be well worth it.
That's wonderful. I want to give an opportunity. We're just a little past the hour, but I want to give an opportunity to folks to ask a question. If I don't see a raised hand or anything like that, I do have one for you. And that relates to, you talked about briefly about the seller staying on and potential for mutiny in the employee base and all of
Mhm.
that. How long did the seller stay on? And was the issue because of they just were used to being the runner of the business and just couldn't let that go?
So they stayed on for 2 months. And one of those 2 months was a month-long cruise in Greece on a yacht. So they definitely lived it up. I think it was really two issues. One was, I think their relationship with their employees was a little bit distressed because they had become a little bit tone deaf. They were making, a couple $1 million a year. They weren't living in Maryland anymore. They were living in Florida most of the year. So they were running the business remotely. They were very, people thought they weren't upfront about the company being in the sale process. And so it was kind of dropped on people at the last minute. And then they were out sailing on a yacht. And then I think the last thing was when they came back, there was this semblance they were trying to run the business, but clearly everybody knew that they were out, had cashed out, were living large. And so I think people's perspective were, hey, we've had enough of them and how they do things. You guys own the business now, so clearly I need to be talking to the people that own the business. And I may not like you guys, but you know, you're who I should be dealing with because you own the business, and me having to still listen to them kind of tell me what to do, but then, be out sailing or living in Florida while you guys are still here didn't make a lot of sense. And that was a tough one. And if I had to do it over again, I would have still removed them, but I would have done it in a different way. Um, that preserved a little bit more of the relationship. But I was being very reactionary at the time, and I think that I definitely would have done it differently. But it was the right decision because, a ship can only have one captain, or two captains if you're co-CEOs, but it can't have four. So it just it wasn't going to work. But it wasn't so much that they were trying to like take over from us. It was just for the troops, for the folks, at the company, they wanted to know who they were following, and that was Michael and I. And so it was just clearer to sort of make that cut.
And we have a quick question from John in the chat. So when you're getting into a business, who are the folks that you think you need to be on the team? Is it the CFO, CRO, CMO? Like, who do you think are most essential?
I think it depends on what you currently have. So I think the first thing that most people will tell you when you go into a search fund business is do no harm and just learn the business for whatever period of time that makes sense. Because you're going to end up doing a SWOT analysis essentially on the business and figure out where you have strengths and weaknesses. For us, there was no one that had any sort of financial wherewithal. So early on, we had planned for it wasn't a CFO. Our business wasn't large enough, but we brought a controller on really early on. I think that more often than not, that's one of the first positions that you're going to have because now you're reporting generally to a bank and to investors. There's a heightened level than what most of these businesses are used to from a reporting perspective. And I don't think it's a good unless you come from that background, and even then it's probably not a good use of your time to do that, but the information is critically important to be right. um, so that generally is one of the first ones. And then from there, it depends on what your growth levers are. And so if your growth levers are really organic growth and there isn't a really strong sales leader or salesperson, that's going to be, something you're going to want to think through. Maybe it's on the operations side. If you really want to grow into a new market and you need to have a new operations person to open that market, it could be that. So I really think it depends, but I think it is an assessment that you should try to do pre-closing to understand as much as you can what you think are going to be your levers for growth. But definitely once you buy the business and in that first 3 to 6 months, you need to be critically looking at the team and figuring out where you have gaps. The only thing I'll say is, again, going back to the spreadsheet, is don't be afraid to build in a team. And I've recognized this one from not doing it in my model, and I've also seen it now as a private equity executive. Most private equity executives, most private equity companies and firms recognize that they're going to have to build up these teams on these founder-owned businesses or these smaller businesses, that the search fund model will ultimately become. And so, they're going to invest in a CFO or invest in a head of sales or a head of operations. And I think there is a lane to do that more in the search fund community, but I see people often want to make the EBITDA as large as possible, one for vanity, and two, because, they think it's going to be less of a multiple. But people are what's going to help grow the business. So don't be afraid to layer in some additional cost. And most of these businesses don't have a team that can scale and grow at the rate and at the level that most search funders are going to want them to. So that would be a big thing on my end, particularly if you're a solo searcher. You're going to need to build a really strong team because you're not even going to have another MBA from whatever school to sort of bounce things off of or share the work. It's just you. So really building that team, particularly, I think, for a single searcher is critical. Did we freeze?
I think Karen froze.
Oh, any other questions?
Keith, I was just gonna quickly ask, what's been your
Thank you
favorite
so
book that
much.
was most impactful for you as an operator?
uh, Ben Horowitz, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. Um, I don't know if you've ever read that. I mean, obviously, the most impactful book I would say is Why Do White Guys Have All the Fun, which is Reginald Lewis's biography. That's the reason why I even thought about this. But I think the most impactful as I was a CEO is The Hard Thing About Hard Things, by Ben Horowitz. And it's just the idea that, this job is really hard and most of us are like not top quartile at it. And that was kind of where I was going with the conversation today, which is, most of us are third, fourth quartile when we start out as being CEOs, but we can move over time if we're kind of thinking about these things. But he struggles to build ultimately what's $1 billion business and does very well, and then goes on to start Andreessen Horowitz, and the rest of it, quoting rap lyrics. But his book is really transparent around the struggles, and I think that's always kind of been my leaning, is to be more transparent around the struggles. Still say, yes, I had a great exit, and I'm investing in search funds. I run a much bigger business, it's 6, 7, 8 times the size that it was. But I didn't get there overnight, and there was a lot of struggle and there was a lot of doubt in that time period. So that was a really, those two books were probably the ones that set me on the course that I'm right now.
And I apologize, no matter what I do, it seems like sometimes I just have wireless issues. But I want to thank you, Keith, for being so transparent about the highs and the lows. And I hope folks will give you like an applause emoji or a heart emoji or something, because this is absolutely wonderful and great nuggets that anybody can take away with them as they explore the search as an option and buy their company. And thank you for being such a great resource for searchers and being welcoming of them reaching out to you by email.
Well, obviously, I appreciate you, Karen, and Searchfunder for the opportunity, and appreciate your work as well. And again, it's the best thing I ever did in life. It's also the hardest thing, other than having a kid, which is the hardest thing. But it's been a worthwhile experience. And so, if you're on the journey, or thinking about it, or you're already through and running your business, I mean, kudos to you. It's an amazing experience, and enjoy the ride.
Thank you. Thank you so much.